iOS development in 2025 can be very confusing. There's a lot of different tech stacks and approaches that you can build. This strongly depends on the project you're working on. For example, you can work with UIKit, SwiftUI, but even with SwiftUI, there's many options. Then now it's async await. There's lots of architecture things to consider with the older MVC and now MVVM or even no view models. My problem with all these discussions can be very confusing. Instead of just theoretically talking about this, I'm going to, in this YouTube series, build one application in multiple ways. So this is the Ghibli API, one of the favorites, where I'm fetching data from a REST API. This is very typical to do in many iOS apps. This is the version that I built first. We have a couple of screens. This is the list. I can go to the detail. I am also fetching other data here. In this case, I'm actually have to do multiple fetch requests. So this is an interesting case of pulling more data when it's necessary, also with these async images. I added these icon buttons, which add these Ghibli films to my favorite list. So this is another screen where I only show the favorites. Again, in this navigation style. Then I have the settings where I can choose between light and dark. That should actually propagate properly to the other app. This is done in SwiftUI, but we also should consider how this is different in UIKit. I also added here another feature for the tab view with the search bar, so we can search for Ghibli films. I added here a debounce, so I don't do too many fetch requests. Now, as you see, this sample app covers a lot of typical things you would do in an iOS application. This is supposed to be a reference project that I can build in multiple different technologies. Now, what are actually things we can use to build this application? As a little grounding exercise for myself, I was like, what are actually apps that you right now would see in your daily work? The tech stack you're using strongly depends on when the project started and what the people decided, also what changes they implemented, what new technologies they brought in. This sometimes cannot be very consistent, and this is one of the challenges. I think it's nicer to have a simple, boring tech stack that consistently goes through the app, because that saves you a lot of head space, and context switching, it is nicer to have consistency. Let's have a look at what you can encounter in today's iOS development landscape. If you're working on a project pre-2020, it's mostly UIKit. There's also Objective-C, but this is something I am not very familiar with, so I'm going to skip that one. But please go ahead and add some of these projects that I'm missing here in the comments section and what your experience with this is. So legacy projects are usually UIKit Storyboards, completion handlers, and delegates. The, I guess, boring tech stack nowadays. There's a couple of problems. There's a couple of caveats with these kind of technology. For example, if you have one giant storyboard, changing a tiny thing, also loading the storyboard in Xcode is very slow, or I usually found it very annoying for pull requests, because if you cannot see the changes in code, if you review somebody else's pull request, it's like, looks okay. So this might be very tricky changes to make. Luckily, there is version control, and you can always go back if you messed up something in the auto layout. The other thing is that because things are more tightly coupled from one navigation, from one view controller, you might have a zag to another one, and this is just a little bit more spaghetti because one view controller knows about the next one. So it's very difficult to reuse these view controllers. The other thing is obviously because this is still completion handler, which is, I'm still thinking in most apps you will have completion handlers and not the modern way of async await. There is some callback pyramids. You might have logic in the view controllers and also some very massive view controllers. Some transitioning from these projects. A lot of these projects that started like this then transitioned into a more mixed bag of technologies. So you can have some UIKit sprinkled in, like smaller screens. I saw a lot of people discussing this, and it seems some setting screens, some logically more static screens, because you don't need to figure out this data flow so much of updating things. So it's more like smaller things inside. Other things that change in these projects is that instead of having one large storyboard, you might have multiple storyboards. You might have a storyboard or a zip file just for one view controller, or you have view controls without any storyboards, so just programmatic. This is then tackling the problem of, as I said, disentangling massive storyboards that are really hard to work with everybody, especially if you have multiple people having to change something in the same storyboard. The other thing that helps to tame the mess is to introduce MVVM, so separating some of the logic out of the view controllers. The problem with modern iOS development is that the apps are getting more and more complex. So what worked 10 years ago, because you had like single screen applications, if you watch very old tutorials, it's mostly just one or two screens, then the storyboard is completely fine and it's actually really nice because you have the visuals. But now if you think of flows with 10 screens, if you add A/B tests or some remote configuration of the user, adds so much complexity that you need to move away from storyboards just to manage this complexity and make it easier. I personally think I prefer the simplest approach. Development is hard enough. If you use a tech stack that adds complexity just because, no, I rather not do that. If simple does the job, then simple does the job. Just using the thing that actually works. The other thing that is interesting for these UIKit projects is that people start to use coordinator patterns. I did a video about this with Combine, and I really like the simplicity of this approach. I will link that video so you can have a look. This programmatic navigation handles that part of, okay, now this view controller showed and this screen is shown. Configure it with this and this data. Handles some of the complexity on a higher level. Now in 2021, they published Swift Concurrency. That's supposed to replace completion handlers. You could also do this with Combiner, but I don't think this is a good use case for networking, unless you really want to go deep. For network calls, the networking layer or the data persistence layers, I think async and await is quite good. The problem is, it's just a lot harder than I anticipated. There's a lot of small caveats. I tried to learn this the last month, and a list of keywords I had to write down to know what they mean. The list is changing every year, now with different settings. If you have to do this in an existing project, it seems like a lot of hassle, and I'm not sure how much benefits you have. So is it really worth it? This is one of the interesting questions that I want to also do with these different projects, to see side-by-side completion handlers and async await, with especially the modern, where I will use the most modern settings just to see how far this is going to push it. Obviously, you can have a lot of different detailed implementations, but this might be too much. So this is definitely one thing that I wanted to test, to see completion handlers versus async await. For this years, when I make these apps, sometimes I will do the whole coding on this channel, and sometimes I'm just going to review code that I wrote before. Otherwise, it's getting out of hand. Feel free to fork the GitHub repos and add your own spin or try different things to it. And you can always link them in the comment section so other people can see this. How does it feel to really work with this? This is one of the things with technology. Sometimes you just don't know if you can do everything you want to. And then you're stuck in decision paralysis or swearing a lot later on. It's really quite tricky sometimes. When you're migrating projects to newer technologies, you need to bridge mentally different workflows, ways of thinking. This can be tricky if you only have, obviously you can't migrate everything from one time to the other, like with the storyboards, so you will have some half. And as I already said, I don't like, it's just a lot of mental strain to work with different technologies in the same project, because then one day you have a ticket that works with an old school view controller, and the other day you have a ticket with a SwiftUI view or async, or it just jumping around, I wouldn't underestimate this, and I prefer simple, consistent styling that you know you're going to stick with for years, even if it's boring. I need to remind myself sometimes, especially since I do these videos, that not everybody can play around with new technology like this, so it's better to just step back and see what is actually pragmatic. So this is the UIKit approach, which I think is most projects still that you're working with right now. And one of the versions of these Ghibli app is going to be in UIKit. You can let me know in the comments, probably just parts of it, because otherwise it's going to take hours and hours, which is also another thing to see the timing. Let's see, it just depends on how much I'm going to swear working with storyboards. I guess this is part of the comparison of these technologies. Now, if you're working with a project that started after 2020, 2021, it's more likely that this was started directly with SwiftUI. It was kind of stable, and depending on the project requirements, especially in the early times, it was more smaller projects where you knew it's going to be okay, not super complex, just to get your feet wet, to get some experience. So this is then starting with SwiftUI, with state object that was with iOS 14 quite important for performance. One of the things that for me was quite a revelation was you need to put so much effort into the performance. It's not coming out of the box. This is probably not a general fault of SwiftUI. It's more for their declarative programming. I saw a Reddit post where they discussed this also for Jetpack Compose, so this is the Android version. Very similar, also declarative. Sometimes a little bit too close or funnily different. And they also, for Jetpack Compose, have problems with the performance. If you think about it, if you want to magically have your UI update correctly, for the framework developers, they probably were like, should we be more conservative and update more just to have the correct UI, or should we squeeze everything out of to have best performance? And I guess you would always lean into more having the correct UI updates to do more updates. Whereas if you do it in UIKit, you as the developer have more control over this. So it is the bar is really high to have good performance for a declarative framework. But yes, the performance is a problem. They improved this quite a lot. In 2020, you would probably have in these projects still completion handler for the networking. I don't think there would be much combined actually for this. A tricky subject for SwiftUI is the navigation, especially navigation view, which was not working intuitively and understandably. This is also to do with the data-driven or the way SwiftUI works of declarative. You have state and you define how the UI works for different states. So having this state-driven navigation is not easy to wrap your head around. There's a lot of different ways of thinking about this. SwiftUI is just quite different to UIKit, and what they also did in recent years, I think, is trying to bring these two different ways of styles but closer together, so you don't need to jump between them. So for example, you can make UIKit more declarative with combine or reactive data flows, but now with the new observation feature, which they added in 2025, it also automatically updates in a UI view controller view, so you can have some lifecycle events that will track these and update. So this is working when you use the new observation feature. They originally started introducing this with iOS 17 for better performance. As I said, this is the main thing with SwiftUI, or some of the main things with SwiftUI. Which is why for the latest tech stack, the most modern, although you probably shouldn't chase this because it changes every year, the most modern in 2025 would be to use Swift Concurrency observation feature. For better performance and developer workflows, we would go more into 100% SwiftUI. They added more features in SwiftUI now. Although there is still some complex layouts that are a little bit awkward. Yeah, awkward is the right word for SwiftUI in some cases. It just doesn't feel like the obvious solution. Some features are quite hidden, especially for layout stuff. For the networking, you would then use async await, and there's different versions of async await and Swift concurrency over the last 3 years. When I was looking into async await, I found like, how many? You see how many videos they published. In the first year, they already had 9. It's like 20 videos that you have to go through, and some of the stuff changed quite a bit, especially now with the approachable concurrency things. The last update, this is the one that I'm going to use for the reference project, just to see how this one now feels and if it's at a good level that is approachable. The good thing is now, after a couple of years of Swift concurrency, there's more resources and testing. Unfortunately, not so many demo projects. I'm trying to use this reference project. There's probably very little to no combine at this point. You can do some of the other things that you did before with throttle debounce, also with some of the task modifiers and some interesting constructions. That's what I'm going to use for this search feature here. The other thing that people complained about in async await is testing. I wrote some tests that I'm going to show you, so we can discuss this. I have a lot of open questions regarding how to use Swift concurrency in SwiftUI projects, especially in a larger context, understanding compiler errors, actually understanding what it tells you, not just using the fix-it. We go for a couple of these, so you see also in this project how I use it in a little bit of a larger project. There's always some variations that you can do and try from this project, it's no problem. I really like to see different versions, so if you add your own version, it's going to be interesting. You can also let me know which of these technologies you want to see and which combinations. The thing with newer SwiftUI projects is that now that it's been around a while and more projects start with this, they also have to consider scalability, because not just smaller projects, but really projects that you want to build up to be large. So you need to consider more scalability and testability with SwiftUI. That changes the requirements quite a bit. Topics that come up is dependency injection, modularization and dependency cycles. Then stuff like MVVM or no MVVM. I have to be honest, when I'm going to have this discussion, I am obviously biased towards my preferences, just so you know. Personally, I think there is a space for MVVM. Just going to show you where I would use it, to which degree I would add abstractions and layers, and why in this positions and not in this one. Not every view needs a view model. There is a balance between adding layers of abstractions and simplicity. If I have to click through one protocol to another, to an extension, and go through multiple files, I'm going to struggle a lot, and this is just not a good developer experience. So you really need to keep in mind. The other popular one is the composable architecture. Now, I am not a fan, I'm just going to say it. I think it's a little bit over-engineered. Some of the concepts are quite interesting, and they're a good way of getting more into design thinking. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to implement this myself. I just don't feel like I should be doing this. Maybe I'm going to find a way of moving this over to TCA, so I can at least show you and discuss this a little bit. What are the pros and cons? Why people actually like this? It's a little bit difficult in terms of, usually I prefer more a flexible approach where you start simple and then add more complexity and layers, different components. Also, if you have different features on different screens, with the composable architecture, I feel it's more like an all or nothing approach. Otherwise, you don't get the benefits. And this kind of restriction is not something I do very well with. It's something I struggle with, at least if it's general, just because rules. But obviously, this is one of the most interesting discussions here, to see a comparison between this architecture in plain vanilla SwiftUI. What happens if you have really plain vanilla, no view models, then you add view models or in certain places where you need it, and you go higher, or you have TCH. So you know it's more like a grayscale where you see the sweet spot that I feel for this and this requirements in this project that I'm working on. My reference project also has specific requirements, so take this with a grain of salt. Then for newer projects, the big leap forward is definitely navigation stack. It gives you more, it just works more naturally and makes more sense. They did this really nicely, so this is a great one that I'm also going to use. You saw some of the tab view improvements. The challenges that you face with these kinds of modern projects is, I think, the limitations of SwiftUI, the awkwardness, changes of Swift concurrency, and less control over the tiniest thing for your UI elements. This is something you just have to live with when you come from UIKit to SwiftUI, which I understand, especially if it feels like a hacky, awkward solution. It can be uncomfortable. Okay, there you have it. These are the 4 stereotypes I just picked. Obviously, you have a lot of variations in this. You can also have a giant legacy project that has a lot of these technologies and sprinkled in different feature models. The combinations are endless, but I wanted to focus on certain ones just to test, to have some references and see how this is working, how this is relating to each other. Let me know what implementations you want to see in more full detail or just as a comparison. The next part of the series, where we actually jump into code to build this project, is with the most modern approach. So starting with the SwiftUI, and I will use MVVM, and testing and observable async await. We'll see how that one goes. I'm always like, oh, this looks like I understand it now, and then something comes up and I'm like, oh, I didn't know this was a problem. But we'll try. This is a learning experience. So the most modern SwiftUI app, and then I will build parts of it in UIKit, depending on how ambitious I am and how much you want to actually see this. And then probably we're going to move on to refactor some of the UIKit stuff into more modern approaches, because there's basically 2 paths that you might encounter, starting out with SwiftUI or starting out with UIKit. I hope you're going to join me through this journey of testing different implementations for iOS development, to get a comparison and a feel of what's out there in the current 2025 landscape, so that on the end we can have a review of all these different approaches, and I'll talk about what I liked and what I learned from this. So we have a goal to work towards too. Thank you for watching. Until next time, happy coding.